Ghosts are known and reported from all over the world and from time immemorial. Here follow 15 short accounts of the spectral realm. In October 1947, ghosts were causing trouble in a most unlikely setting. Instead of haunting a decrepit old hovel or a draughty stately home, cleaners at Heathrow Airport in London were complaining that a ghostly presence in the jumbo jet gangways was terrifying them. They refused to work alone at night because of the spooky feeling. The manager of the company which employed the cleaners said an inquiry was being held. The site of the future airport was farmland and heath, where until 1819 highwaymen would congregate to rob travellers. The lair of the highwaymen, known as Hounslow Heath, was where Terminal 3 now stands. The airport originated from a small aerodrome known as Great West Aerodrome, which opened in 1930 on the site of former farms and market gardens. This was used by the Royal Air Force during World War II, before in 1946 becoming London Airport. Because of the association with highwaymen, it is said the ghost of Dick Turpin, who was hanged in 1739, was responsible for the feeling of a hot breath blown across the necks of people, often airport employees, and for the sound of a man howling when nobody is there. There is a second ghost of more recent vintage. At 9:14 p.m. on the 2nd of March 1948, a Dakota from Brussels with 3 crew and 19 passengers nose-dived into the ground during a thick fog. The plane caught fire when it crashed. An airport worker managed to force a way into the burning plane and drag one passenger to safety. He said he saw other passengers screaming as they struggled to free themselves from their safety harnesses. In a matter of seconds, the plane was a blazing inferno. Only 3 people were rescued from the crash, with 2 of the crew also managing to escape. During the recovery of the bodies, a gentleman appeared out of the fog and asked rescue workers if they had seen his briefcase, before disappearing back into the mist. The ghost has been seen ever since, walking up and down the runway, still looking for his missing briefcase. In 1970, radar showed the image of a man on the runway, but when airport police went to the spot, they couldn't see anybody. The radar operators told them he was standing right in front of them, although the police couldn't see anyone. They drove forwards and were told they must have run the man down, because now he was behind them. The search was called off. A brigantine named the Spume in Genoa Harbour was beset by a poltergeist in 1913. There were only 3 people sleeping aboard, 2 men both over 60 and a lad of 12, when the trouble began. They were awakened by a clattering of chains in the hold. The plates and basins began to dance about, and a pall of coal dust engulfed them. Some nights later, the poltergeist began its mischief afresh, and this time the owner of the vessel, a Mr. Negri, called for the police. When they boarded the ship and began their search, one of them felt as though he had been hit by something metal, but invisible. The next day, while witnesses watched in awe, everything on the ship was overthrown and smashed by the malicious ghost, from stern to stern. According to an Australian soldier, Private P. Gordon, who wrote to a mate back home in Auburn, New South Wales in 1941, there was a ghost near to his camp in the Middle East. His description of the haunting was published in the Cumberland Argus and Fruit Growers Advocate on the 18th of June, 1941. He said there was a female ghost dressed in white robes seen at night. He wrote, "There is a huge rock close handy to here, and inside is the remains of Cleopatra's bath, cut out ages ago, and a narrow entrance leads to it from both ends. Each night at midnight, when the moon is at its brightest, she comes out all dressed in white robes. She sees us there, and quickly commences to disrobe. We all made a mad rush down the cliff, but she vanished as quickly as she came," says Private Gordon. "Some chaps digging around here a few days back came across 2 human skulls, probably an old burial ground. Goodness knows what treasures are about. There is also another large cave with smooth finished walls and rooms inside. From the walls, small cubicles are let in large enough to take a human body. We think this is an old burial place with its vaults and crypts. Nothing to see ghosts flitting across the sand while on guard at night, concludes Private Gordon. In 1946, a correspondent wrote to the Weekly Times in Victoria. He said he lived in the country and that they used to own an old white horse, which had drowned in a river some time ago. A couple of years ago he had been fishing in that river at night when he glanced across the water to some reeds. The horse stood there a while, with his head up, and then vanished. The man called out to his friends, but they were too slow to see the image, and said he was nuts. The writer ended up by saying, "It seemed so real. Or am I nuts?" A police sergeant is not typically the type of person given to flights of fancy. In March 1917, an unnamed sergeant was on his way to work at 4 a.m. in Perth, Western Australia, when he noticed a buggy drawn by a horse, but without any driver, going at a fair pace on the wrong side of the road. He attempted to catch up to the buggy on his bicycle, but couldn't overtake it. During the pursuit, he called out to constables on the beat to stop the buggy, but they couldn't see anything passing them. The buggy turned into St George's Terrace, but by the time the policeman arrived, there was no sign of it. He listened and heard the sound of horses' hooves in the distance and rode toward them. He found a milkman on his rounds, but it wasn't the buggy which he had seen. The mystery vehicle, which only he, it seems, could see, had disappeared without trace. Port Louis is the capital city of Mauritius, the Indian Ocean island famous as the home of the dodo. Government House was built by the French, with significant rebuilding carried out in the mid-18th century. In the mid-1950s, it was rumoured the building was haunted by the ghost of an old admiral, who could, though, be easily placated by leaving a glass of rum out for him on a table. The British governor of the island at the time scoffed at the haunting, saying it was rubbish. The home of a labourer named Buxler in Karkutsstrasse, Stettin, Germany, was assailed by a poltergeist in August of 1910. The unearthly manifestations proceeded for a long while before the chaos became publicly known. Cupboard doors would be flung open and the contents inside spilled to the floor. Cups and saucers, along with jugs and bottles and pots and pans, would lift into the air as though held by invisible hands, and then be thrown out the window into the courtyard of the building. Brooms hovered in mid-air, as if ridden by transparent witches. Although the focus was undoubtedly the 11-year-old daughter of the Buxler family, who was sickly and undergrown, but, according to neighbours, possessed of wondrous magnetic gifts, the blame was placed upon a goblin. This fantastic creature was said to have entered the house to steal money, but was thwarted, as the key to the family's money box was worn on a chain around Frau Buxler's neck, despite the money box vanishing. The creature, in fury, then caused the havoc, including physically harming the girl. Her arms were covered in scratches and marks in her flesh, like the paw prints of a cat, which some observers said was self-inflicted by the girl. A police dog was said to have refused to enter the tenement, despite all commands, but it was also said that it had been left in the courtyard and no attempt to take it into the dwelling itself was made. What was intended to be done with the dog is unclear. One police officer asked Frau Buxler if she could entice the goblin to appear, but she replied that she had annoyed it and it would not come at her command. When asked what she had done to annoy it, she said she could not say, or disaster would befall her. 2 nuns from a religious house visited the home and prayed for a couple of hours, which was believed to have exorcised the haunting. Police, however, were sceptical, noting that Herr Buxler had been spending many hours at the local beer house and suspecting that that was where the money box had gone. They informed the family that if the goblin recommenced its tricks, they would be arrested for gross nuisance. Ah Kun was a Chinese man who had come to the Victorian goldfields to seek his fortune. He lived in a hut at Golden Point in 1871. He worked as an interpreter for the police at Ballarat, among other things. He had had two strange brushes with ghosts. Recently, Arcoon had been woken one night by a tapping on his door. Opening it, he saw a retinue of misty figures with Chinese faces and draped in white robes disappearing into the darkness. Arcoon wondered about this sight, but returned to bed. He was soon roused again by tapping on his door. This time the procession was more distinct, and he saw it was led by an elderly Chinese man with a long white beard. The line of figures once more disappeared, and Arcoon slipped back into bed and pondered what he had seen. As he lay unable to sleep, there once more came a tapping on his door. This time he hesitated to answer it. Knowing these figures were from the other world, he quickly thought back over his life to try to remember if he had made any promise to the dead left unfulfilled. Then he remembered that local authorities had objected to the Chinese custom of burning hell money at the graveside in the cemetery in case a bushfire was started. Arcoon had promised to have a small fireplace and chimney built for this purpose. He had not done so, and was convinced this was the reason for the spectral visitants. Opening the door, he found the group arranged in a semicircle before him. He addressed the leader in Chinese, vowing that he would have the fireplace and chimney built, and apologising for bringing the spirits out in bad weather. Arcoon did as he said he would, and had slept undisturbed ever since. Some years earlier, he had been awoken by something pulling on his shoulder. He woke to find a large cat with a white breast standing beside him. He knew by its behaviour that it was not an ordinary cat, and addressed it in Chinese and in English, but it seemed not to understand either language. As the cat was unable or unwilling to speak, Arcoon decided to have the cat write its message, but recalled that in Chinese tradition, ghosts could not hold pens or pencils. Thinking over his problem, Arcoon fetched an iron tea tray and smeared it all over with oil. Then he sprinkled it with fine ashes. The cat used a paw to mark Chinese lettering in the ashes, which said that he was the spirit of a Chinese man whose body lay unburied at Long Gully. He asked Arcoon to have the body found and buried, and if an inquest was necessary, begged that the body not be mutilated. Then the cat vanished into thin air, and Arcoon returned to his sleep. The next morning he rode to Long Gully and found the body where the cat had said, and arranged for an inquest and burial. In 1912, a house in Chicago owned by a Mr. J. Deuterlander was valued at $11,700 by tax assessors. The owner protested this amount, claiming that he could not induce any tenants to stay at the address for more than a few nights, due to a ghost disturbing their slumbers. The ghost was that of a young woman, which shrieked and groaned all night. The woman had been a tenant who was murdered in the house 4 years before, and her killer remained unknown. A new assessment was made based on this information, devaluing the property by nearly $4,000 due to the haunting. An impertinent ghost caused trouble in Newcastle, New South Wales, in February 1970. Michael Cook, aged 19, his 18-year-old wife Diane, and their 4-month-old daughter fled their weatherboard cottage after being haunted by a green-eyed ghost. The ghost showed its face at windows, passed through locked doors, messed up beds, shifted items about, and even made itself a cup of tea. 8 friends and neighbours confirmed they had seen or heard mysterious events in the house. In May 1937, a brief report stated that drivers and garage staff at one of the London transport depots were convinced one of their buses was possessed by something evil. The vehicle had been involved in numerous serious accidents and was heartily disliked. Attendance at a spiritualist meeting might have triggered the appearances of the ghost of a Roman Catholic priest. Father Sharrock was the first rector of St Mary's in Eccles, Lancashire, who died about 1890 in the presbytery which stood on Liverpool Road. In December 1931, this same building was the home of the Lees family and used during the day as an insurance office. For 5 years they had been haunted by the white-clad figure, which resembled the appearance of the priest in life, which appeared irregularly in the house. When waking up, the Lees would sometimes find their beds moved from the positions they were in when they fell asleep. A friend of the occupants had seen the ghost walk through a wall at the foot of the stairs and disappear. Exasperated by the haunting, the Lees approached the incumbent rector, Father Drescher, for aid, and he visited the house and sprinkled holy water in each room and bestowed a blessing. It was not, he explained, an exorcism, as he believed the manifestations were not evil. He said the ghost could come because the person left something undone before they died, or as a reminder of another world to come. Father Sharrock was buried in Mostyn Cemetery, and prayers had been said for him in his old church. One of the odder forms of ghostliness made its appearance to the Jones family in Wales in the 1930s. David Jones was a colliery foreman who lived with his wife and sons in a hillside cottage. They dwelt there contentedly for 5 years, until the black cloud came. Jones came home one day and found his wife unconscious on the floor. When he roused her, she told him she had been sleeping and been awakened by something pressing down on the bedclothes, which tightened around her. She recalled putting up her hands to fend off a dark, shadowy mass, and then fainted. After that, Jones and his son, also named David, slept in that room. Mr. Jones said he too felt the bedclothes being pulled tightly around him and feeling trapped. His son had felt a presence too and lit a candle, but nothing could be seen. The candle was snuffed, and whatever it was returned. A black flowing mass, darker than the darkness. Jones went icy cold, and his son yelled out, "Get up, Dad! I can see it over your head." They relit the candle and waited for dawn. The next day, the family made the decision to quit the house, which in 1936 was still empty and a magnet for the curious to come and look and wonder. This tale was recounted in a popular magazine in 1989. 6 friends had been water skiing on the Hawkesbury River in New South Wales. Driving home near Windsor, the road was clear, when suddenly, from nowhere, a black FJ Holden car suddenly appeared just a few feet ahead of them. The driver, John Ephra, slammed on the brakes as his friends shouted warnings about hitting the other car. Even as he did so, the black FJ vanished, like an image from a TV screen. All 6 people had seen the car and agreed it wasn't a reflection or an illusion. Later, the driver learned from a local policeman that there had been many reports of a phantom car on the road, and many accidents, including one smash that killed 4 people. In 1889, Milan Obrenović, who had proclaimed himself King of Serbia in 1882, abdicated in favour of his 12-year-old son, Alexander. Alexander had an unhappy reign, coming into conflict with his parents when he decided to marry a widow named Draga Masin in 1900. She had been a maid of honour to his mother and was 12 years older than Alexander. Not only did they and the rest of the ruling class think he had married beneath his rank, Draga was also known to have enjoyed a libertine sexual life and was thought to be infertile. Their brief marriage did prove to be childless. On the 11th of June 1903, conspirators intent on replacing the king with a rival claimant, and led by an army captain who later led the Black Hand, the terrorist group who assassinated Franz Ferdinand and precipitated World War I, stormed the palace. Alexander and Draga were found hiding in a cupboard or a safe room, and shot and disemboweled before the corpses were thrown from a balcony. The conspirators were never punished for this regicide. In February 1905, Queen Draga's yacht, which had been purchased by a Belgrade merchant, was sailed up the Danube to Budapest. Stories had already circulated that not all was right with the yacht, and a full crew could not be found for the voyage. When moored in Budapest, a dinner party was held on board. It was said that people on the quayside heard a scream from the yacht and saw a young woman in evening dress run along the ship and onto the gangway in a desperate flight to land. As she ran past them, they tried to find out what had disturbed her, but all she gasped was, "The face! The face!" before continuing to run as far away from the yacht as possible. The next morning, the rumour spread that the light had gone out during the dinner, and a blue mist appeared with a head staring out, hideously gashed and streaming with blood. "It is Dragas Ghost," was the cry. The following day the crew deserted, and it was with great difficulty that anyone could be found to go on board and watch the vessel. Finally, an old man named Birnbaum agreed to the job. The next day his relief arrived and called out, but received no reply. Spooked, this man fled, claiming that the devil had carried Birnbaum away. 3 nervous policemen were sent on board and found Birnbaum, on his back in the saloon, a look of horror on his face. When wakened, he staggered to shore, saying, "The face, the face."